Welcome to the Notes to My Legal Self, AI Insights, where law and AI collide. Get ready to level up your legal game with us. We've got career advice, cutting-edge developments, mind-blowing legal tech, and more. Know someone making waves in the legal AI world? Nominate them, or even nominate yourself. We love courageous souls. And don't forget, we want to hear from you too. Ask questions, drop comments. Let's build a community of legal superheroes. But here's the deal. We're all about to have a blast. AI may be serious, but we're here to make it fun. So buckle up, get ready to power up, and let's embark on this exciting journey together. Now, let's introduce your fearless host, Olga Mack. Get ready to dive into the awesomeness of Notes to My Legal Self, AI Insights. Let's go.
Hello, everyone. We are in for a big treat. We're going to talk about open source, which is an opportunity for us to learn, to figure out what we're going to do in the future, ask questions. And I have a special guest, someone I've known for a long time, someone I actually consider to be my mentor. I've known her since law school. I've seen her do some incredible things. She inspires me every time I have conversations with her. And she's actually practically my neighbor. So today I have a conversation with a neighbor. Heather, welcome to Notes to My Legal Self, AI Insights. Please introduce yourself.
Oh, thank you for that nice welcome and the kind words. And I'm very happy to be here today. I'm Heather Meeker. I am a lawyer and a venture capitalist. I've been practicing law in Silicon Valley for nearly 30 years now, and I've been working as a venture capitalist for about 5 years. In both respects, I'm a specialist in open source software. So I've spent a lot of time analyzing open source legal issues, and my venture fund, OSS Capital, only invests in commercial open source development. So I've made a little bit of a tweak in my career lately, but it's been lots of fun lately.
Oh, I love it. So you say lawyer and venture capitalist in one sentence. That doesn't come often. How did you get to a sentence like that?
By the way, I never would have guessed that would have happened. I am not a finance person at all. It just so happened that about 5 years ago, my business partner, Joseph Jacks, he's known as JJ, he started a venture fund that only invests in commercial open source development. And for those of you who don't live in the VC world, having a fund that is that focused is actually highly unusual. But he was a true believer in the idea that open source was a great tool for businesses. And we had some contacts in common. The open source world is not huge. So he just called me and said, "Would you like to be involved?" And my first reaction was, "I'm a lawyer. What am I going to do?" But then I thought about it, and it turned out that my practice in open source software licensing had been changing over the years. It started with kind of the basics like compliance and so forth. And then it had moved substantially into advising clients about using open source as a business strategy. And so actually that dovetailed very nicely with what the fund was going to do. So I started out as an advisor to the fund, and then about 2 years ago now, I joined full-time as a general partner. So I leapt into the world of venture capital.
And before that, you were
Sorry?
before joining the fund, where did you practice?
I've started my career at Wilson Sonsini back in the heady days of the internet boom. That was really quite an experience. Went through the internet bust there. And then I went off to Greenberg Traurig, which is a large international law firm. And I helped open their Silicon Valley office. And in the meanwhile, I had been developing my specialty in open source and developing clients in that area. And then about 10 years ago, I moved to O'Melveny and Myers, and I was an equity partner there for about 8 years. And then I went off on my own for legal practice because I wanted to spend more time working with my venture fund.
There you go. A few things you've done in life. And in addition to that, you wrote a couple of books. They're my favorite books, but I'll let you share about what they are.
Thanks. Thank you very much. So I've written a few books. The first one was when I was teaching a class as an adjunct at UC San Francisco and UC Berkeley on technology licensing. So that's about technology licensing generally. I wrote that book because I was teaching a class and I couldn't find a good textbook. So I thought I'll write one. And then I wrote my book about open source, which is called Open Source for Business. That's been out for quite a while now, and it's enjoyed some success. That is a book intended for lawyers, but also for engineers and business people who want to understand open source licensing. And then this year, I published another book called From Project to Profit. And that one is really about the strategy of building businesses around open source. So the Open Source for Business was more about what I learned as a lawyer, and From Project to Profit is more about what I've learned as an investor.
I'm a fan of both books. I love this book. And if you can't see, you probably can't see. It's underlined. I'm rereading it again. I love it. I read the second book as well. It's one of my favorite. I think it's really helpful if you're practicing law to understand what I think is a very complex area of the law. So I'm going to ask you some really hard questions because
Good.
you are the woman to ask those questions. So I may as well. So let's start with a completely easy one. How can you make money giving away software?
That's what most people ask first. And that's why I wrote the book, because I get that question from a lot of people. Like, how can you possibly make money giving software away? And the answer is I'll try to give an analogy that helps. What you give away with open source software is source code and some rights to change it, share it, and use it, and so forth. But source code isn't a product. As an example, if you wanted to buy a car and someone said to you, I can sell you a car for a great price, but there's a catch. I'm just going to sell you all the parts to the car and I'm not going to put them together. Would you buy that? And unless you're a very special sort of person, you would not buy that. You would prefer to buy the car that had been put together, because if you tried to put it together yourself, it might not be roadworthy. You might not know how to put it together, and you might not be able to get it licensed to drive on the street. Open source based products are the same way. What people buy is finished product, and the open source part is not really a finished product. The reason people have trouble distinguishing between the two is that I think that in the tech business, we are trained to think too much about IP rights, in the sense that we think we're selling IP rights. And in fact, there are no businesses that sell IP rights other than patent enforcement entities. So if you are, say, building a software product, you're building a product, and the source code is a tool to build the product, but it's not really the product. What people are buying from open source based businesses is the finished product, and the delta between the source code and the finished product is where they make their money.
Okay, let it sink in. For both, I think both technologists and lawyers may have a default thinking that is different for different reasons.
Yeah.
But I think that analogy of a car, that you're not buying parts, you're buying more than just a car. You're actually most of the time buying an experience.
Yes.
Right? You are buying much more than a roadworthy car. What I'm buying car is the feeling of my hair go through the air as I drive on Highway 1 and listen to my favorite music, which is, I think, actually where most buyers, when they make an important, expensive decision with respect to software, they're buying an experience.
Yeah,
So
I think that's right. I would also say that often what they're doing is they're buying the solution to a problem, and source code is not really a solution to a problem. Even if you had that, you would still need to do a lot of work to deploy it and maintain it and make sure it was updated and so forth. And so what they're buying is like quality control. And I think that's very similar to buying an experience. What a CTO wants when they're choosing software for business is they want to make sure their problem gets solved in a reliable way and that they can trust that product. And that's all about reputation, which is very similar to the experience aspect of a product like a car.
Yeah, absolutely. But then, how do you think about IP rights? Because you wouldn't go as far as saying that IP rights don't matter. I know that for a fact. So in that, whether it's experience or reputation that you're buying, different customers are motivated differently. What is the role of IP and I guess parts as you are developing an open source product, solution, services?
First of all, you've got to break down IP into different areas, and they're quite different. I'm going to put patents aside because actually most software businesses, not every single one, but most of them don't. They might have patents, but they don't really do very much with them. So their main IP rights are copyright and branding or trademark rights. So with respect to the copyright, that's where the open source licenses come in. And where they really come in is that when you give products to people, they don't have to buy from you the right to use the software under those IP rights. They may be buying other things from you like service, quality control, online systems, and so forth, but they don't have to negotiate with you for the IP rights. And that actually makes the business process easier. Also, those of us who have been in the technology business for a long time remember the days when every enterprise software deal involved a software escrow. And open source has pretty much done away with those, not just in open source, but in proprietary too, because the expectations of customers have changed a lot. They expect to get source code now and solve their business continuity issues that way instead of with an escrow. And that's pushed into the proprietary world because it's changed the expectations. So what that means is that once the customer gets the software, they don't have to go back and have another IP negotiation. It's just a negotiation about the business matters. The trademark's totally different. Trademark rights are extremely important to all businesses, including open core or commercial open source software businesses, because open source licenses don't grant any trademark rights at all. If you want to take some open source code, let's say I release some open source code and you want to use it and make your own version of the product, you can do that, but you can't call it by my brand. And that is actually hugely important. A lot of companies, they just leave the copyright grants on the table and they say, go ahead and use our software, but you can't use our brand. And they enforce their brands actually very strictly. So IP is important, but it's more nuanced than I think the way most people think about it.
Yeah, and thank you for breaking it down. And for those folks who are curious about, the book actually goes into a lot of greater depths on why trademark is important and patents is very different. If you want to geek out as much as I did, and I'm going to do this again because it's actually so much fun. And if you really want to be my friend, you will geek out with me, just like Heather is doing it now. You can definitely read a lot more. There are chapters on this and a deep dive with a ton of examples, which I recommend. But Heather, what I want to focus on right now is why it's, suffice it to say, everything you just said is complicated, and there is a book described the complicated. So if you are an entrepreneur building in the area that is complicated, why would you get up in the morning and invite complicated into your life? And maybe I'll reframe the question relevant to you because you're an investor. Why would you choose to be in this really meaty, complex, geeky area of the law? There are folks like me who enjoy geeky conversation, but in the end of the day, VCs want to make money, and many folks choose the easier route.
Yeah, exactly.
Maybe a less complicated route. How about that?
With respect to entrepreneurs, they choose the open source route because they just love the way open source causes them to be able to innovate more. You don't have to sell open source to entrepreneurs at all. And honestly, the technicalities of the licensing are things they might not understand very well. I actually talk to lots of entrepreneurs who say, yeah, I love open source. And then you start having a slightly more meaty conversation with them about the licenses. And it turns out they don't understand them at all. But that's not their job, right? They know that open source development creates great products. So that's the level they approach it on. For me as an investor and for our fund, I think the complexity, first of all, I love geeky complex things, but
And that's what we've been friends for almost
yeah. LPs don't necessarily love complex stuff, the limited partners who invest, but the complexity actually helps us in our fund because when we talk to investors, I'm sorry, when we talk to entrepreneurs, we talk to potential portfolio companies, and they're trying to make a case that we should invest in them. The conversation we don't have to have is, how can this possibly work with open source? Which is a potentially kind of complex conversation. They don't have to explain to us why it works. And actually, many of our investors in the fund are also entrepreneurs who have worked in the open source space. We have a lot of individual investors, and we don't have to have that conversation with them. Like, we just streamline that whole process. Whereas an investor who is just investing generally in technology, there's no particular reason why they should have all this specialized knowledge about why open source is good investment and how the business models and licensing models worked on a detailed level. So it just like moves, it clears the road when we're dealing with entrepreneurs and when we're dealing with a lot of our LPs, so that we don't have to have that complicated conversation. But we understand it very well. So when the companies start trying to deploy their business and make money, we can give them very pinpoint and expert guidance on, okay, this is how you need to do it, and help them plan out their business model. So I think it helps us overall.
Okay. Complex still. And you have specialized knowledge. So if anyone were to do it, it's you and JJ, whose passion for this industry is no limits, I believe. If I know this guy.
We're not the only ones doing investing in open source companies, but I think we're the only VC that only invests in open source companies. And then there are other investors who have done other models like incubators and so forth, but we're more of a traditional VC. And I don't think there's anybody else doing that.
So let me ask you this question. There is an AI revolution going on. I think, can we agree on that?
Oh yeah.
So we're on the same. I just want to make sure that I'm not the only one who's in the revolution and everybody else is going forward like as is. Is there a relationship? Is there an impact between open source AI? Is there a symbiotic relationship? What do you think?
Yeah, I'm now thinking about how much time we have to talk. This is a huge question.
And remember, I know how to interrupt people. So let's start. I think it's an interesting conversation. It's a really relevant conversation. I care deeply about this conversation. So for that reason, we're going to talk about it because I care deeply.
That's perfectly fine. First of all, I think that AI is software 2.0. I think that as we look forward in the landscape of, I won't even call it software, like what computers do, we're still going to have procedural code. And open source really grew around traditional procedural code, source code that human beings wrote. But we're also going to have AI, which is trained. It's not really written by people. And as I look into the future, we're going to have a model, I think, where there's a mixed landscape. I think that procedural human written code will have a place in the world for a long time to come. But AI is going to, or machine learning, I should be more specific, is going to make a big encroachment on that. A lot of people ask lately, does that mean programmers are going to be out of work? I think absolutely not. I just think they'll be doing slightly different things. We're going to take a lot of the day-to-day grunt work out of coding with a lot of AI technology. So it definitely has a huge impact. the other thing is that right now, AI, there really isn't a definition of open source AI. This is one of my hobby horses. By the way, I did a TED talk on this, which just came out today. So
Congratulations. It was an
yeah.
amazing TEDx talk in San Francisco. For those folks who don't know much about him, Heather is very humble. It's very hard to be invited to speak at TEDx San Francisco. As somebody who done it a long time ago and did not at the time appreciate how hard it was because that would just came to me as a snow in July. I later learned that I was actually very fortunate and special. And now
Yeah.
that I'm older and wiser, I appreciate that opportunity more. And Heather recently talked about the very topic. So why don't you now share? So now that I set a stage to add even more achievements to otherwise very achieved woman, share about your topic.
Yeah, so it really is my hobby horse lately. My hobby horse topic is that the we have this definition of open source, and it's served us for 25 years and more. And it's a definition of software licenses. If But it's not really a definition of what software is or source code is. So when you move in from software to AI, you then have to do a lot more work to figure out what quote unquote open source means. And the term open source may start to lose meaning over time because no source code for AI, it's a model. And if you ask I think the essential question is, if you look at an AI model and you ask, what do I need in order to reproduce this model, modify it, share it, understand it, and study it, which are the basic reasons why the open source model exists in software, the answers to those questions are not nearly as easy as for software because there are a lot of moving parts. There's the model, software used to train the model, data used to train the model, the training plan, maybe a user interface for it. There are a lot of pieces, and some of those pieces are not software. So the community right now is struggling to figure out how to define open source AI. And the overarching reason for that is we want transparency. We want access and transparency, but we have to figure out how to enable that. Meanwhile, the AI industry is largely going down the you get no access and we're completely not open path. And that actually worries me a lot.
There are legislative pressures
Yes.
about openness and access and transparency and ethics. If AI Act EU just recently passed, and I believe those are important pillars in that, and there will be no pillow when you fall from that. Absolutely not, because I think this act will get more teeth than GDPR. That will be more scary than anything, especially if something goes wrong. There will be a version 2 of this. So there are pressures, and the United States is taking again a patchwork approach, but very much there are pressures to make it open. Do you think there is a pass here?
So one thing that concerns me is that there is a narrative going on that if we have regulation, we don't need transparency. And I think that narrative is coming from like some of the biggest companies that don't make anything open or transparent at all. Whereas having lived in the open source community for all these years, my personal belief is I prefer transparency. If I had to choose between transparency and regulation to keep things honest and appropriate, then I would choose transparency. That doesn't mean that I think that there's no room for regulation. Obviously, regulations are going to be a good thing if they're done properly, but I don't want regulation to be a substitute for transparency. I think that's a harmful narrative. And I and many other people are trying to work from the other direction and say we need to figure out what transparency means and not just have a set of regulations that says that people have to do things the right way and then we're going to trust the government or private actors to enforce when that goes wrong. because I don't think the government or private actors really have enough access and resources to police the use of open source. I think that transparency is, which is a self-policing mechanism, is extremely important.
Because you have it from the community, because the
Yes.
community will call you out much sooner
Yes.
than the FTC will. I agree with that.
Absolutely.
I completely agree with you. I actually want to just maybe finish one more thing. You talked about ML specifically having impact. For the last year, we have Gen AI blowing up and creating drama and excitement
Yes.
in this field. What is the impact of that?
There is a big issue, or at least a putative issue, I don't know, about copyright and generative AI, and there I
That's not a big issue. It's a pink elephant in the room.
yeah, uh,
It's actually breaking down the room. That's how big.
yes,
That and privacy, those two together are two massive pink elephants. But
yes,
yes, go on.
absolutely. I made a list of the current lawsuits about copyright and generative AI, and I might not have gotten all of them, but I think there are 17 active lawsuits, many of which are class actions.
Yeah, I was
Um,
about to say 17 hides, and behind 17, there's like a gazillion entities and people behind. If you
yes,
break it down, this would be a much larger number.
yes. And the law about whether it is, I would say, like prima facie copyright infringement to train an AI model on a copyrightable work is an issue that actually businesses have been struggling with this for quite a while. Everybody started talking about AI about a year ago, but for many years, companies have been doing AI forever. What happened in the last year was ChatGPT, right? And lots of other transformation models. But this is a known issue that's been around for a while, but it didn't really hit the public consciousness until recently. So you've got a big outstanding issue about whether, say, you train a model on an existing copyrightable work, whether that constitutes copying or whether it constitutes infringement. And there's no clear answer to that under the law, although I think that many of the lawsuits are actually don't have a lot of merit. Maybe some of them will. We're starting to see dismissal of some claims, but it's going to be a long time until that plays out. Some other countries, I know that Japan and Israel have done this, and I don't know if maybe one other country, sorry, I don't remember, have actually passed laws saying it's not copyright infringement to train machine learning models. But in the US, we don't have any specific law on it. And unless Congress actually acts in some way to resolve that question, we're going to have a lot of litigation about it for a long time.
Yeah. Google Books 2.0, here we come.
Yeah.
I think that's where we are in life. We are coming to the end. I have a few more questions. I actually want to focus in the end on business models. You say a lot of interesting things in the book. One of the more interesting things for me as entrepreneur is the one around open source business models are good for inflation and recession. So let's talk about it. Tell me more. Why do you think that?
So this is from the point of view of the investor. Really, before the pandemic and everything started going haywire in our economy, even before that, I was thinking, how do open source projects do in recessions? Because it was my thought that they do very well in recessions. And in fact, I did some statistical analysis, although the data set was not huge. And I looked at all of the successful open source projects and I tried to figure out when they were started. And it turned out that a great many of them were started during recessionary periods. And there are good reasons for this. During recessionary periods, developers get fired from jobs and they go to open source projects in order to create their own credentials, get ready for their next job, or just to have a project to work on. And and so you see a lot of really successful stuff coming out of recessionary periods. So to me, during recessionary periods, a lot of innovation is going on, and you're going to see the result of that maybe a year or two after that happens, right? So there's a little bit of a time lag. Anyway, I did an analysis. I wouldn't say it was extremely scientific analysis, but to the extent that I was able to get data, it bore out my premise, which is that there are a lot of really good open source businesses started during recessionary periods. The other thing that I did was I did some thinking about why open source businesses do well during inflationary periods. Now, the thing is, in our country, we haven't had an inflationary period for so long that there are literally lots of entrepreneurs in the tech business they're so young, they've never seen an inflationary period, right? But I'm older.
You find that we're skewing older? I'm determined.
I lived through the really bad inflation of the late 70s and so forth. So I have a somewhat different view. I'm always expecting something bad to happen. But the thing about open source businesses that make them great as an investment, if you have the patience, is that they are extremely capital efficient. Open source businesses, by the way, they've been working remotely forever, right? They don't have offices. We have portfolio companies where the founders have never even met each other in person. That's typical in open source development. So you can take a small amount of capital and use it to fund development of an open source project and build a business around that. And it's one of the most capital efficient kinds of businesses, I think, that you can start. And then the way open source works in the market, it sells itself. You don't usually have to have a big sales force because the community drives a lot of sales. And particularly if you're selling a product that's sold to developers or it's in the infrastructure area, there's a lot of word of mouth marketing that happens. If you give an open source company a modest amount of capital and you have a little bit of runway for them to grow, because I think they take a little bit longer to grow, then they can do amazing things with a small amount of money. So for that reason, in an inflationary time, you really want to be investing in capital efficient businesses because the cost of capital in inflationary times goes up so much and it gets hard to raise money. As an example, in our portfolio at OSS Capital, we were looking like all the other VCs were and asking our companies, how much runway do you have? And when are you going to have to raise money? Because there's no money out there right now unless you're an AI business. Right? And they almost universally told us, oh, we have 2 or 3 years runway, or we have infinite runway because we're covering our costs with sales. And that was just so gratifying to hear because they're not starved for money. Whereas in more traditional VC investing, you've got the whole blitz scaling idea and the idea that you pour a ton of capital into the business. With open source businesses, you just don't do that.
Yeah. So on page 82 of this book, 83, 84, there's a useful table of all my choices of business models, and you will only find out if you actually hold a copy of the book in your hands. I'm going to ask you a question about that table. I'm an entrepreneur. What business models perform best for a scalable open source software business? This is a very selfish question because that's where my mind is today.
There are a lot of them, but I would say the most common one, and so maybe it's the most easy, is you create an open source project and you build a software as a service behind that. So you have open source software which people might run locally on their own for free, and you create community interest around that, but then you offer it up as a service because a service adds a tremendous amount of value in terms of quality control and value and just value add to the customer. I think that's a really easy way to create that delta between the open source software and the finished product. There are a lot of companies doing that. It's often called an open core model. So the core is open source, but then you add all this other stuff to it, which you actually put in a commercial product. So I think that's the SaaS model is probably the easiest one to deploy.
Okay, great. And then folks, I've now worked with a lot of technologists, developers, business folks, but let's just skip to developers and technologists. They love open source. It's a community. It allows them to showcase their skills, do some good, meet some people, work remotely, be capital efficient. Like, there's many reasons why they love it. But some of those things should not become a business.
Yeah, definitely.
Like, not every hobby I have will be a profitable business, and not every open source you're part of should aspire to be a profitable business for similar reasons. What is the sort of telltale signs that's a hobby, not a scalable business?
That's a really good question. By the way, we've run into a lot of great open source projects that we really like the project, but there's just maybe no way to really make a business out of it. And some are open source projects really just should be community projects. There's nothing wrong with just running a community project. You have to figure out how to fund it. Private capital is just one way to fund an open source product. But I would say the telltale sign is if you're a founder and what you want and your objective in making a business out of the open source software is to pay your own salary and maybe hire a couple of your friends, that's not the right business, certainly for private money investment, because that's not going to be what your investors expect. Also, another really important telltale sign is when we talk to founders and they say, yeah, we would really like to run this business getting grants from government. That's not really a business either. It's more like it's a different kind of business. Almost skews more towards running a nonprofit than running a for-profit business. Part of what I put in the book is some information to help founders test their expectations about whether they really want to run a business or not, and whether they want it to be the kind of business that takes on outside investors, because then the expectations for returns will be much higher.
There you go, folks. Lots of things to think about. And if you want to continue going deeper on this issue, the book is the place to go. Note to self, if you're my neighbor, you may end up interrogated on my LinkedIn Live/podcast, and you will love it. So that's how I make sure that folks moving into my neighborhood are of high quality. Heather, thank you so much. This was an incredible conversation. I personally learned a lot. We covered a lot more ground than I expected to cover in the LinkedIn Live 40 minutes. And thank you so much. What is the one thing you want folks, whether they're lawyers, technologists, business professionals, take away from this conversation, given that there may be very degree of technical knowledge or even open source knowledge? What is the one thing you want them to take away or think about or consider as they go forward with their life?
So I think people in the open source, the traditional open source camp and the traditional business camp can tend to see open source versus business as the right way to think about things. I don't think that's right. I would encourage people to think about open source was actually, as a term, was created to build bridges between the free software community and the business community. And I encourage people to look at ways that people can use open source as a business tool, as opposed to just like using open source that other people create, and to see the areas of overlap so that the sort of community aspects of it and the business aspects of it can coexist together, and not to perpetuate a narrative that they are at odds with each other or they can't coexist.
I love the way you think, and I love that this is a great takeaway. I think there's definitely an opportunity for open source to keep promoting business and good things in our life. Heather, thank you so much. I knew I would enjoy it, but I thoroughly enjoyed it. It exceeded my expectations. So thank you so much for being on the show. Thank you for sharing your knowledge in all of your 3 books. They're all valuable. And they happen to coincide with my progression in my career and my interests. I know that was not a goal in you writing it. Nonetheless, I really appreciate that you did write it and that your timing is good. So thank you so much for all of that. Thank you, everyone, for joining, and I'll see you next time. Bye, everyone.
And that brings us to the end of another thrilling episode on the Notes to My Legal Self AI Insights. We had a fantastic time exploring the fascinating intersection of law and AI with you. But hold on tight, because the adventure doesn't stop here. Stay connected with us on social media to continue the conversation, share your thoughts, and be part of our incredible community of legal enthusiasts. Together, we can inspire, learn, and make a real impact on the world of law and AI. If you enjoyed today's episode, we encourage you to share it with your friends, colleagues, and anyone else who could benefit from the exciting insights we discussed. Let's spread the knowledge and enthusiasm far and wide.